Thank you very much, Russ. Let me introduce your panellists to you. On my immediate left is Richard Dennis. Richard is an economist and he's also the Chief Executive of the Australian Institute, a public policy think tank in Canberra. On his left is a man that of course needs no introduction. You've of course recognised him from the papers, Ross Gittins, the economics editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. And to his left, Simon Pillar. Simon is formerly a management consultant and the founder of Pacific Equity Partners, a private equity firm. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the panel. We're discussing today the GFC2. Have we learnt anything yet? Now, the backdrop to our discussion, of course, the uncertainty over sovereign debt in Europe, the viability of the Eurozone, question marks over whether China can sustain the rates of growth that they've had, concerns over whether the debt that is endemic in America is sustainable and the unfunded liabilities that they have. These are just some of the issues in the background to today's forum. Should we be worried in Australia? Should we be concerned? Now, I'm going to turn to Ross in a moment, and I thought we could start our discussion by looking at what have we learnt from the GFC in terms of what it says about our economic and financial system. So Ross, what does it tell us about the operation of so-called free markets? Have we too much confidence in them?
Well, I think we certainly did have too much confidence in them, or the people who are running the various countries did. I'd have to exclude Australia from that to a large extent because we didn't. Our banks have been very well supervised and didn't get themselves into too much trouble. And what lessons we did learn from that, our Australian regulators have been encouraging the banks to do. But really, the lesson is that even if you accept, as I do, that capitalism is the best way to organise economies, the system does need to be regulated, because if you allow just sort of greed and self-interest to be unrestrained, then we've demonstrated that a bunch of businesses are perfectly capable of causing enormous problems for themselves, and more particularly for the rest of us. So regulating isn't easy, but we have to do it. And we do it actually in the interests of the sustainability of the capitalist system.
If I turn to Richard at this point, you speak of sort of regulating self-interest, but a certain degree of self-interest is needed, I assume, for our system to operate.
Oh, look, absolutely, and I think we have to be careful not to fall into a simple trap, sort of whose side are you on? Are you a red tape nanny status that wants to tell everyone how to live their lives, or are you a free, rugged market individualist who can trust individuals to make decisions in their own interests? The fact is, life is complex, and the grey area in the middle is where we live. And keep in mind that in America, where you are free to buy an AK-47, you are prevented from buying blue cheese from France because, hey, let's face it, that unpasteurised cheese is quite risky. Okay? So, we live in a society of, confusion when it comes to regulation, and we need to see through this. And when it comes to the banks, of course we need to regulate them, we always have. What we need is an ongoing dialogue that isn't the simple conversation, is regulation good or bad? The interesting question is, under the circumstances and given available sort of technology and given our community's attitude to risk, are our current regulations the best we can think of? Okay. Now that's a longer, more boring question, but don't fall for the trick of picking teams.
So in this sort of trade-off between releasing self-interest in innovation but needing to regulate it, Simon, from your observations in the sort of financial and banking industry, have we seen, or how would you describe, I guess, the shifts that might have occurred that you've observed in that industry?
I think if you go back to the sort of question that we're trying to answer here and think about what some of the root causes were in what's created the global financial crisis. Here's an interesting statistic. America in the 200 years to 2000, as a country in aggregate, racked up $6 trillion of debt. In the 8 years from 2000 to 2008, it racked up an additional $9 trillion of debt, just over that 8-year period. And there's a whole set of things that we can go into as we go through our discussion as to what caused that. But certainly one of the factors that was involved there was what happened in the financial services community in terms of the debt products, the collateralized loan obligations, and so on and so forth. And that was, I think, to the point that Richard talked about, that was an explosion of banking activity that was driven by self-interest in an environment where the regulations were struggling not just to keep up in terms of the regulation, but actually the regulators were struggling to keep up with what was going on. And that was fundamentally an important part of what was happening. And I think it's symptomatic of a cultural shift, if you like, that's happened in the financial services sector over quite a long period of time. But the underlying sort of value system, I think, has shifted over that period.
So, and part of that shift possibly is a lack of trust we now have in such financial institutions. Perhaps we once felt that our bank manager had our best interests at heart, but perhaps he doesn't. Ross?
Well, I think that's true. I have to say that I finally decided to move my business away from Westpac, and I found it very difficult. The main reason I did it was that they didn't have a single automatic teller in the whole of my suburb. But I had a lot of loyalties to Westpac. It was my father's bank, it was my church's bank, it had been my bank since the day I got a job. But eventually I thought, no, let's not be silly about this, Ross. If they think it's in their interest not to have an automatic teller in your suburb, you've got to find another bank. I found one that had an automatic teller right where I wanted it to be.
So self-interest does play a part.
Yes, it does. I mean, if we don't want a nanny state, we do have to believe that people can and should manage their own affairs. And self-interest can be just, it can be becoming Scrooge, or it can be just creating situations where the rest of the community has to help you out. And we do want to encourage an arrangement where most people are capable of managing their own affairs without requiring the rest of the community to help them, which is not to say that I'm opposed to helping those people who need help.
So Richard, in some of your work, Affluenza and other works, you focus on the question of sort of horizon, what perspective people have. Are we sort of witnessing here a shift from long-term questions really to just short-term gain?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the main problems that's harmed the banking industry was that rather than the conservative idea of banking 20 years ago, the main job of a bank is to lend money to people who always pay it back. Is this a good asset that I'm lending against? The banks shifted their time horizons into what's next quarter's profit, and the most profitable way, or the most effective way to increase that profit was to bring revenue forward and shift risk back. That is, that the banks were collecting higher margins on more profitable lending today, but they were actually increasing the risk for future bank bosses after they'd retired, or maybe even themselves 2 years after their current contract was up. So banks have brought consumption forward, and the whole point of debt is, of course, to say, have fun today. Don't save up. Why wait? You can have it now. But banks have got very good at concealing the other side of the coin. If you want it now, you have to have less in the future. Okay, and to anyone who spent $5,000 more than they earned last year, say on a credit card, to get back to square one, if you spent $5,000 more than you earned last year, you need to spend $11,000 less this year. You can't keep spending $5,000 a year more than you earn. You have to pay back the $5,000 you had fun with last year, and you owe them $1,000 in interest. Now that sounds a lot less fun than the ads for credit cards that are basically just saying, you can have it all, you can have it today. Well, you can have it today, you'll just have less tomorrow.
So part of the reaction to the GFC was really the moral outrage at these bonuses that were being paid to executives and traders. So Simon, part of this, picking up on what Richard said, this shifting of risk from now till tomorrow, but taking the benefits today, is that what we've been seeing happening with these executive pays? And
yeah, no, I think very much so. I mean, I think that you sort of crossing over from regulation into incentive and incentive setting at an individual organizational level. If you assume the fundamental drivers of people in an organization, you have to set incentives to drive those behaviors in the right direction from an organizational perspective. And I think it's hard to argue that many of these institutions in our financial services sector haven't been rewarding short-term outcomes at a massive cost in terms of long-term stability. I must just segue into this article which relates to this topic. I don't know how many of you have heard of a magazine called Private Eye. It's a British satirical magazine, and this is a spoof article, interview with Bob Diamond, the former managing director of Barclays, who was caught up in the LIBOR scandal. Bob Diamond has admitted that he was shocked to discover the extent of banking practices taking place in some of his most profitable criminal divisions. I would describe the people carrying out this banking as a few good apples who were certainly not representative of the vast majority of Barclays investment bankers, Bob Diamond told MPs. These idiots were driven solely by a love of savings and investments. They should be ashamed of themselves. But I think that's a spoof and a satire. But to some extent, it gets at the core of one of the problems that we're seeing here, which is the banking system for hundreds of years have been set up to provide savings and low-risk investment products for the likes of you and me. And through the noughties, that exploded. And there was this crossover between principal investing, which generated massive profits for these organizations. People made multi-million-dollar bonuses. But the money that they were using was your and my money. And then, of course, there's the moral hazard of the government then having to step in because these institutions are too big to fail. But at the core of it was that, that mix of incentivization, which caused havoc.
a few people want some quick investment advice coming through with these SMSs, so we'll deal with these quite quickly. Should we sell our BHP shares? Is the resource boom over? And what about the housing bubble?
Well, I'm not a licensed financial planner, so please interpret everything I say in the general rather than specific. Look, Australian houses are so expensive because we're so willing to pay such a large proportion of our incomes to buy them. I mean, you and I, Ross and I show up at an auction, really, and say we earn the same amount of income, the amount,
I earn far more than you.
Well, I work for a not-for-profit, so that's a good thing. He works.
I work for a no-profit.
Maybe that's why. But imagine in the hypothetical land that Ross and I earn the same amount of money. If we're at the same house bidding for the same auction, the house price is a function of my willingness to spend a percentage of my income versus Ross's willingness. And if I'm willing to spend 35% of my income to buy the house and Ross is willing to only spend 34%, then I win the auction. Now, what's happened in Australia in the last 20 years is the community norm for the percentage of our income we're willing to bid at an auction has gone through the roof. So a house price is worth exactly what Ross and I can agree it's worth. It's culturally determined. The banks have fueled this, in part by lowering the deposit requirement. When I bought my first unit with a $20,000 deposit, I couldn't borrow more than $120,000. At an auction, I couldn't have bid more than $120,000, even if I was willing to spend a high proportion of my income. Today, with $20,000, a bank would lend me probably nearly $500,000. So, you know, house prices are not some objective truth that economists can tell you what they're worth, and Australians are willing to spend a far higher proportion of their income on houses than almost anyone else in the world.
So that'll come really to what we'll move on to in a moment, questions of values that we have. Just very quickly, the resources. Ross, do you have a comment to make?
Yes, I'm not a licensed investment advisor either. The resources boom in terms of building a lot more mining capacity, and particularly natural gas capacity, has got a long way to run. And as that thing matures, then the Australian economy will be exporting a lot more minerals and energy than it used to. In that sense, the mining boom is far from over. Remembering, however, that the way economists judge it is in terms of growth. Everything is measured by growth. And so for growth, this year has to be bigger than last year. The point will come where this year is not bigger than last year. It may be a bit less, but it's still a lot more than a normal year. So that, you need to remember that. As for BHP, I've got no idea what that implies for their shares.
Good. All right, well, let's move our discussion into this realm of our values and what the GFC has really exposed. We've touched on the sort of corporate culture question that, with that satirical piece that Simon mentioned. You know, why is it that we have this sort of cowboy attitude? Is there a difference between the persona people can have at work and really their private life? What's going on here, Simon, do you think?
I think it's a very complex question. You know, I think that corporate culture, you know, it's something that you can see change over time in any organisation. I used to work many years ago in an investment banking institution, and as I've watched that over, you know, literally 25, 30 years, the culture of that organisation has shifted massively. And we've seen, you know, as the LIBOR scandal, particularly around Barclays, has come out, some of the commentary, some of the answering of questions in front of Parliament in the UK, you know, some of these behaviours just were norms within an organisation. So I think leadership is a big part of that. But I think this incentivization piece is also a very important part of it as well, and that's where the leadership piece comes out. You know, you get what you incentivize, and I think that organisations that are, you know, perceive their culture to be at odds with, or the results that they're getting from their culture to be at odds with what they're striving for, need to look at how they are incentivizing behaviors within the organization. But, you know, it's a complex beast, and I think it's a fundamental leadership issue, both from at the board level through, you know, the senior levels of the executive, all the way down through the organization. And that in turn comes down to, you know, individual values as well.
Yeah. So you've mentioned the issue of incentive, and obviously that's pecuniary. Richard, I might turn to you at this point. Is that because, you know, in terms of our values, we really only, at the end of the day, value things which have a price?
Well, no, I don't believe that for a minute. I think that most people value put another way, the things that most people value most highly are things that we would say you can't put a price on.
But are we consistent in really?
No, absolutely not. And this is the problem, that some things are sort of, we often think some things are taken as read. You know, well, of course I love my family and I wouldn't sell them for a particular price. Think about it, like that's a silly question to ask.
Perhaps not in some parts of the world.
I was going to say, but then, no, this is exactly my point, that's actually cultural. Sometimes people do sell body parts or people. This happens in the world.
And when I work 60 hours a week to make money, allegedly to assist my family, I am really implicitly putting a price on my relationship with my family. And I'm saying the money is worth more to me than spending time with my kids.
So we believe one thing to be true, but we just don't put it into practice.
Well, but again, I would say, as with regulation, life is complex, but let's not kid ourselves. Well, no one actually believes that money is the only thing that counts, but the problem is one of when we delegate authority to people, whether it's our parliamentarians or business people to make big decisions on our behalf, when all of their incentives are wrapped up in how certain financial indicators go, well, don't be surprised that they make decisions in line with those incentives, even if in their own personal life, they might care for their kids, but in public life, they won't invest money in childcare. It is explicable. And I just give, a quick example of where incentives and competition and regulation all overlap. The Tour de France was a drug-fueled frenzy a few years ago. That's what competition led it to. People wanted to win. There were massive rewards for winning. They took drugs. They're called performance enhancing for a reason. They work. They enhance performance. And the people winning are typically the ones taking them. It's up to regulators. It's up to us as a community to say, is that okay? Yes, I know I told you we were going to heap praise on whoever won, but I don't want you to win like that, is a moral question. It's a question that is imposed from the outside. And we have lost enthusiasm as a society. I'd say lost the courage to say that's not acceptable.
Yes, and that can create problems for individuals in the race.
Yeah.
I don't want to take drugs, but what's the point of going in the race if other people are taking drugs and they're going to beat me? I mean, people will often end up, a lot of people will end up saying, well, I don't really have much choice if I want to continue performing in this sport. That's an example of where regulation, action by government, makes it better for everybody.
And because to continue that analogy, I mean, I think it's a useful analogy. We all know the money that cycling teams or countries are spending on developing, the next masking and the next drug, and the regulators who are trying to regulate drugs in sport have to spend more and more money. And I think that's actually one of the challenges that we have in the economic sphere, is that, leave aside whether the regulations work or not, our willingness, our political willingness to actually put the funding behind, the regulator to actually make the regulations bite.
Absolutely.
Is not there.
But also, to stick with the sporting analogy, if Ross and I, again, pretend we earn the same amount, sorry Ross, and we both want the same next promotion, if he's willing to work 70 hours a week, then I have to too. If he's willing to take drugs, then I have to too. So this is, I think, one of the real problems that we have with morality and market conduct, is that when it's winner take all, it's very hard for individuals are placed in an invidious position where they do want to win. And if I want to get my kid into the best school, if the price of the best school is 25 grand a year, then I'm going to have to earn at least 150 grand a year. And if the only way to do that is to work 70 hours a week because Ross is, willing to work 70, then we create competitions where individuals might do things that if we all sat back and took a deep breath, we would all prefer to not do.
When Professor Ian Harper, a professor of economics, gave the 2009 Smith Lecture on the GFC, he commented that really markets are amoral and they will reward as much an industry that supports kidney dialysis machines as it will child pornography. So are we saying here, Ross, that in a sense we have to find our moral base outside the system because the system isn't going to provide it? And is it what we're experiencing, a little bit of a sort of a moral vacuum in a sense?
Well, yes, I think all of that. And markets are amoral. Economics is amoral. It's not immoral, it's just not interested in morality. It abstracts from moral questions. And the individuals have to bring their moral standards to bear and not allow themselves simply to be caught up in the competition, which it's very easy for us to be caught up in. I mean, that's why we're all watching the Olympic Games. I mean, I'm not, you are, because people enjoy competition and they enjoy being in the competition as well as watching it. But we've got to remember that economics and markets are a very efficient way of handling the sort of daily business of life, but we shouldn't allow that and the values that are espoused and implied in the way markets operate, we shouldn't allow that to determine solely the way we want our politicians to run the country, and certainly not the way we want to run our own lives. And sometimes that will involve tough decisions that say, I am not going to keep up with the Joneses because I'm not prepared to pay the price that's needed to have a new European car in my driveway and renew it every second year. And
yet this urge to want more is very strong, and Simon, you'd no doubt see it every day in your business life. To what extent does that reveal a certain insecurity that somehow these material things are going to provide?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, don't just pick on me. I think we all see it, don't we, in ourselves as
but
well
you
as
work in private
as all
equity.
around. Well, that's true. That's true. No, I mean, I think that you can't escape. Again, going back to that extraordinary statistic of the ballooning of debt through the early 2000s. That wasn't debt that was going into people's savings. This was being used for consumption. So there was an enormous expansion of consumption, an enormous expansion of the perspective that asset prices were going to continue to inflate, and so I'm going to use cheap debt to buy more assets, and I'm never going to fall, never going to fall foul of that. So there was a consumption-led debt binge through that period. What drove that? Exactly what we're talking about, which is the notion that we find our value as a society in stuff. And I respect what Richard was saying about the desire to do the right thing for our children's education, but that's a very, very small part of that consumption package. A lot of it is just stuff, things that we drop on our toes.
Well, Simon, Jesus famously said that a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So how do you reconcile that personally as a Christian?
Well, to take another passage from the Bible and look at, there was a story that Jesus told, some of you may know it, called, which is sort of entitled The Rich Fool. And it was about this guy who was an incredibly successful businessman. He was a farmer. He had great crops. He reinvested. He built bigger barns so that he could get richer and richer. And then sadly, the night when his investment program was finally complete, had a big party and then dropped dead. The lesson that Jesus was the one telling this story was trying to say to his audience is, he was a fool. He was a fool because he placed his self-worth in stuff. He placed his self-worth in the money that he was earning from his business, building bigger barns and so on. But actually the thing that really mattered, and this was the judgment on him, was that he wasn't rich towards God. I mean, that you can unpack that in many ways, but that was his fundamental error, was that he was placing his security in stuff and not in the thing that really matters, because stuff decays, you die. But if God's real and he exists, then surely the most important thing Jesus is saying is to know him and to be rich towards him.
Thank you. So Ross, you've written also in this area in terms of understanding our utility, our happiness, and to what degree we can derive it from things. I think you describe a sort of hedonic treadmill that we can be on. It's almost self-fulfilling.
Yes.
How do we get off that treadmill?
Well, the hedonic treadmill says that we do get satisfaction out of acquiring things, out of pay rises, out of promotions, out of a new car, a new house. But that the kick that we get from that is actually very brief. It takes us very little time before we get used to the new car or before we acquire an ambition to have an even bigger car. And so that's the hedonic treadmill. You can stay on that forever and just keep pounding away, because unless you keep pounding away, that form of happiness will decline. How do you? Well, you just stop playing that game. And you don't have to stop playing it by moving to Nimbin and being a hippie. You can slowly withdraw from the game. You know, you can start with saying, I'm going to drive a Toyota that's perfectly a reliable, acceptable car, gets you from A to B without any problem. It's going to sit in my drive. None of my neighbours are going to be impressed, but I don't care. I have different priorities. I care about the way I treat people. I don't really care about what they think about my status relative to them. To pull back from that status game, which is what keeps a lot of people on the treadmill. It really does. There are ways to withdraw from that, even if you're only doing it in small ways, and that they can accumulate and give you greater freedom. And the greatest freedom is not worrying about what people think of about your status.
So on this issue of freedom, Richard, sometimes I think that freedom comes through choice, but really choice isn't all that it's cut out to be at times, isn't it? You've written about this in the book of Affluenza.
Yeah.
What's some of the solutions do you see towards these fundamental problems?
Well, again, as with everything, I'm not some Blairite third wayist, but I do think we have to look for the middle, the hard parts. And choice isn't good or bad. Some choice, too much choice is bad. Not enough choice is good. Not enough choice can be bad. So there's no right amount, but we certainly shouldn't believe that more choice is always better. And if you've ever stood staring at a whole wall full of margarine thinking, who cares? Or milk. And that's okay, but it's actually designed, that's a deliberate strategy. They want you to think, I don't care, I've heard of that one, I'll have it. So if you've got 40% market share, confusing people actually reinforces that. A test of my main answer would be about status and choice is, as Ross said, to reflect on, do you care about what other people think? But a quick test for you, seriously reflect on whether you could do this. Show up at a friend or family member's barbecue or relaxed social function with a nice big 3-litre bottle of no-name cola. Walk in, say hello, offer it to your host, and then walk off and pretend nothing had just happened. Not Coke, not Pepsi, no-name cola. Here's something for the esky. Walk on. All right, maybe they'll serve it to the kids. All right, but my point is a simple one. What you do, what you buy, says something about you in our society. And it's hard. It's hard to do what Ross said. It's really, really hard. And people, often people, oh, look, I drive a Prius, that's because I'm not interested in status. Well, actually rubbish. It's a different form of status. We live in a very complex society, but I think step one is awareness. Step two is, knowing that it's not going to work, and then we all have to work together on step three.
The sociologist Robert Lane, in his work, The Loss of Happiness is in Market Democracy, says, if your life is driven only by extrinsic motivations, extrinsic goals rather than intrinsic goals, not only will you feel dissatisfied and empty, you actually will make yourself sick. Self-gratification is ultimately futile. Simon, what would you say in response to that in terms of where we find value and meaning and what goals we set for our lives?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that comment. I mean, I think that if we find our worth in things, I think that is a chimera, and I think that it is ultimately disappointing. It's the hedonistic cycle that Ross was talking about. I think ultimately, my worldview and my view on these things is formed from a Christian perspective, but I think ultimately, we as human beings are built to be in relationship. And I think our fundamental, value, our fundamental worth is found in relationship, not in stuff. I think that's challenging, as Richard and Ross have said, because our whole world, our whole consumer society screams at us stuff and things. But within that sort of notion of relationship, I think that ultimately human relationships, whilst they're wonderful, have a terrible habit of letting you down. And ultimately, my perspective, the worldview that I have, is that we have to find that meaning and that value in a relationship with a God who exists, and that actually then informs the other relationships that we have around us. So I think that the meaning of, or the idea of value as an individual is found in that relationship, and that informs those relationships. But I think I don't see any place for genuine, purposeful, long-term self-worth in stuff. It's a chimera. It decays.
Time is going to beat us in a moment. I would like to give each of you a final word in a second, but before I do that, Ross, you've also written about the importance of relationships. How do you see us perhaps bringing that into our decision-making at the expense of some of these materialistic outlooks?
Well, I think the starting point is to be aware that if you think your relationships are the most important thing in your life, guess what? That makes you identical to everybody else, because that's what they think. The question is whether you actually act on that. And the problem is that the world is full of so many distractions and temptations that we can have this as our core belief, but not actually ensure that it influences at least most of what we do in each day. And so the first thing is to realise that, yes, I believe that, but everything about me is tempting me to ignore my relationships. And relationships are very easy to ignore, because if they're a decent relationship, you can easily convince yourself that they'll still be there once you've gone off and done something and worried about some other priority that you have. So being aware of that, I think you just have to be mindful about the need to always be saying to myself, should I be going into the office on the weekend, or should I be dealing with my family? I think I do this myself, and it's I go out on Saturday nights to functions that I think I really need to go out because my wife wants to go out and wants me along. I could stay home and work, but I try not to do that. And after years of neglecting your family, you realise that you've got to change your ways, and I think to some extent anyway I have.
Okay, wonderful. I'm sorry that we haven't done justice to all the questions that have come through, and we might see whether we can indulge our panellists to perhaps offer some answers that we can post later for you. But just quickly, a 30-second wrap from each of you. Perhaps Richard, Simon, and then Ross can have the final word. GFC2, what have we learnt? What would you wish to say?
Look, I'd say let's not put faith in very high-paid, selfish, greedy bankers. They are very highly paid because they're selfish and greedy, not because they have some unique insight into the kind of world we want. Just very quickly, the Australian Institute's done work in Bahas on what we call deferred happiness syndrome. Sound familiar? You know, if I do all this today, I'll be happy in the future. Often family members don't agree. Well, that's the point. You know, you're telling yourself it's for them. You ask them, and they say no, thanks. We run National Go Home on Time Day in November. And a quick plug, if you're interested in that sort of stuff and the things I'm talking about today, then just Google the Australia Institute to get our email updates, or send me a Facebook request to be my friend. I've never said no.
You're stressing relationships there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Close, intimate.
Simon?
Yeah, I think we are seeing, some change in behaviour at a consumer level, aren't we? I mean, consumers are delevering, retailers are hurting because people aren't spending as much money. But I hope that actually the most important lesson that at an individual level we take out of the global financial crisis is that, the hope that we had in consumption, in buying stuff through that debt-fueled binge in the early 2000s has proven to be, to be fake, and that people will look at that and say, my value, the value that I place in stuff is misplaced, and that they seek, real value elsewhere.
And Ross, the final word.
At the public policy level, what I'd say is we've realised that we do need to regulate the economy. That regulation is very difficult. It's easy for it to be bad regulation, to overdo things, but we've had an experience where underdoing it has got us into a lot of trouble. So we've got to keep the answers somewhere in the middle, and we've got to keep working on that. As individuals, I think we have to accept that although we're caught up in this big system and it affects us, we have to accept responsibility for our own part in it, and for charting our own course as best we can in a way that where we seek intrinsic satisfaction, that is, doing a job that you enjoy, doing a job that you do well, giving customers value for money, and believing that will give us that will give us a lot of satisfaction, deep satisfaction, and part of that, of course, is relationships.
Wonderful. Please do join me in thanking our panellists.